Hey, good evening, everyone. It's Pastor Jeff here from Trinity Baptist Church in Sherwood Park. Thanks for joining me here tonight. You might be from Trinity, many of you are, but you might be somewhere else in internet land. And hey, just tune on in. We're going to do a little online Bible study here, as we've been doing all throughout the fall season. Today, we're actually going to finish off our third book study that we've done in total since COVID began. And we're going to finish off the Old Testament book of Daniel. I hope that as you've journeyed through this particular series with me, that this book is perhaps maybe a little bit less intimidating than when you first looked at it. Hopefully it's more accessible to you. It can be seen as really confusing, but yeah, I hope this has helped. Anyway, just so you know, this is our last study. We'll take a little break over the Christmas season and we will get back into something else in January. So I would love to hear your own ideas for different topics or Bible books that you would like for us to explore in January. So you can leave a comment here below or you can email me directly. What we're going to do today, though, is we'll pick up where we left things off. We left on a bit of a cliffhanger last week in chapter 11, verse 35. And so we'll pick it up at the next verse. Daniel 11, we'll start at verse 36. And as you turn there, I thought, let's open up with just an opening kind of question, much like I did last week. What trajectory do you think that the world is on? Do you think like the world is going to hell in a handbasket, so to speak, or like just, do you think it's going downhill? Do you think the world is getting better and we're kind of on the up and up? Do you think the world ultimately is kind of same old, same old? Love for you to think about that and perhaps even to think about what has shaped your perspective on that. Maybe just a little bit of background information for fun. Throughout the centuries, Christians have believed some different things about that exact question. In fact, there was an end times view that was far more popular when North America was first discovered. I know that's not the right word for it, but when it was first starting to be inhabited by people from Europe, and they had this view called post-millennialism, where they believed the world was getting better and better and better. In fact, the old hymn, "We've a story to tell to the nations," is a classic expression of this optimistic view of the world. In contrast to that kind of an upward view, we have what's probably the more common end times view, at least in North America, and that's a premillennial view, which believes that the world is going downhill. And ironically, I think it's ironic that we hold that in North America because we actually have it pretty good, really good compared to most other places in the world. And yet we have this pessimistic view. But anyway, and then a third view that's been quite popular and continues to be quite popular for many Christians is this kind of same old belief. Yeah, the world has its good times, it has its bad times, might go in certain cycles or phases, but on the whole, evil exists and goodness exists, and it's going to be like that for the most part until Jesus comes back. So again, I don't know what your personal views are on that, but that's just a quick little side note of what different Christians have believed over the centuries. I think we're going to get a few clues within this particular text from Daniel today, and we could look elsewhere in the Bible, but we'll focus on Daniel. And let's look for that answer a little bit in our text. And as we do that, let's also look for a couple of other key words and concepts today. And let's look for the word or the concept of worship, resurrection, and wisdom. We'll find those. So let's get into it. As a reminder, we're at the tail end of the longest vision in Daniel. We saw one vision in chapter 7, another one in 8, and a different one in 9. But chapters 10, 11, and 12 actually have the same long vision. But we've seen that all these visions together, they don't build on each other chronologically, so to speak. They're mostly functioning like Russian dolls, those kind of ones where you keep popping them off and they're smaller and smaller. In a sense, we're getting more and more detail here about the second and the third kingdoms in this 4-kingdom theme that Daniel has had in his book. So we left off last week hearing about this one particularly corrupt king from the north side, the north kingdom, this guy called Antiochus IV. And the rest of chapter 11, we'll look at today, continues to focus on him. In fact, verses 36 to 39, it's just basically another summary of this king's bad character and his rule. He does whatever he wants. You can see in this paragraph here, it tells us that he'll exalt himself above any god, whether it's the gods of his ancestors, gods of other countries, or even the God of Israel. And he says unheard of things against the God of Israel. Remember, he's this yappy little horn whom we've met in some earlier visions. But remember too that and this is one of those key words that we're going to look at today. Remember, one of the key themes of Daniel is worship. Who you put your ultimate trust, your ultimate allegiance in. This particular guy, he seems to like a god of fortresses. That might be a reference to Zeus, might be to others, we don't know. But it fits because he himself is a guy who builds fortresses, and we'll see that. Verse 39 mentions that this guy will reward people who honor him. And we saw a hint of that last week, just a few verses earlier in verse 30, where he shows favor to specific Israelites who forsake the Holy Covenant, who forsake God's word, and instead they pledge allegiance to this particular guy. They take a shortcut. But ironically enough, despite how bad this guy is and all this gross stuff about him, in verse 36, we're reminded that God still has this guy on a leash. He will only be successful until the time of wrath is completed, as verse 36 says. For what has been determined must take place. So God has a purpose in all of this. And this guy has a firm time limit on him. So as we look at verses 36 to 39, that little paragraph there, none of that is actually new information per se. This is, again, it's kind of that Russian doll thing. We're just getting greater detail about this one ruler whom we've met many times in Daniel's visions right near the end of this third kingdom. But we do come across some new information about this guy in verses 40 down to the end of chapter 11. I think the simplest way to summarize this paragraph is that it summarizes what happens to Antiochus IV from the time that he desecrated Jerusalem's temple in 171 BC until his death just a few years later in 164 BC. So as the paragraph opens up, it talks about at the time of the end. I think we've got to clarify that means his end, the end of this horrible king of the north, Antiochus IV. It's not talking about the end of the world. But as the rest of the paragraph explains, he'll storm out against Egypt and other countries, including Libya and the Cushites, who are up in the upper Nile, or kind of south Egypt region. But verse 44, it mentions some reports that come to him that trouble him. These are likely reports that came from the emerging Roman Empire, who's really quite ticked off at him and want him to kind of stay in his lane, so to speak. History seems to indicate that Antiochus IV died in Persia, and he did not die of natural causes. But at the end of verse 45, when you read it, it's ultimately actually quite tragic. This guy dies without any allies around him, without any mourners around him. That's not the way that any of us would want to die. I mean, we actually want people at our funeral, and we want people to cry at our funeral because they've known our love and they're going to miss us. Now, when you look at this particular paragraph, I mean, couldn't this whole passage, especially this paragraph, maybe it could be about the Antichrist? Yeah, I suppose. But it must have meant something profound to its original readers too, and I don't want to skip over that. And let's remember, again, according to the context of this whole book of Daniel, this guy is really appearing only at the end of the third of four kingdoms. And then we've got God's kingdom coming after that. So we still have a fourth kingdom to come, and then we've got God's good and glorious kingdom to come. It seems a little early for talk about Antichrist. But anyway, let's move ahead in the passage to chapter 12. Now you would think with that nasty king being dead, things might get better. But nope. Unfortunately, instead, as verse 1 says, there will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. That sounds like a pessimistic view of the world's direction. Now, to be honest, as we get into this, Here's where I get a little bit confused about the chronology that's being referred to here. Are the events that are described here in verse 1, are they describing the decades of unrest that happens between Antiochus IV and when Rome kind of finally sets up shop? Hmm. Does it describe the fall of the city of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire? And that happened, we know, in AD 70. I mean, Jesus uses similar imagery to predict Jerusalem's destruction. Maybe. Does this describe the final tribulations before Jesus comes back? Maybe. Maybe all of them. And again, if we go back multiple weeks to where we were at earlier, I use that telescope analogy where you can zoom in kind of to focus in on different things in the line of sight. Maybe that particular analogy is helpful for us here. But despite all this bad news and kind of heavy stuff we've been looking at so far, there's some great news that we see here later on in verses 1, 2, and 3. Listen to this. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Oh, that's so good. Everyone whose name is found written in the book will be delivered. That's a great promise. And for us, we know as Christians that almost that exact phrase is used later on in the book of Revelation, where we have this book of life that's mentioned. If you belong to Christ, if he is the one whom you worship, whom you give your ultimate trust and allegiance to, you got to know that this promise is for you, that God has a book with your name in it. You have an inheritance kept in heaven for you. So good. So as a side note, let's talk about another word, not worship this time, but the word resurrection. Some places in the Old Testament, they speak about kind of a general, like a national resurrection. So you could look, for example, in a pretty famous passage in Ezekiel 37, the kind of the description of the valley of dry bones. It's kind of talking about a whole nation being resurrected. And you see a few places in the book of Hosea as well that kind of have that national view of resurrection. This is one of the places, though, even in the Old Testament, that speaks very clearly about the resurrection of individuals. All individuals, but as individuals. When we die, we don't merge into the cosmos. We're not kind of in this nirvana thing. And I know we could speak more precisely about some other worldviews with that, but maybe I'll just kind of leave it there. Your individuality as a unique person is preserved on the other side of the grave. Verse 2 here mentions that all will awake. This general resurrection, not of nations, but of all individuals. But when everyone is resurrected, yes, some will go to everlasting life, some to everlasting shame and contempt. There's two options, not 17, two. Now, if that sounds kind of out of character, let me remind you that in again, the Old Testament, in wisdom literature in the Old Testament, like Proverbs and other places, you typically have two types of people and two paths. You have the wise and you have the foolish. You don't even have to look in wisdom literature. Look here in the book of Daniel, and you have this person like Daniel and his friends who are truly human, following the Lord and being faithful to him, being gifted with all kinds of knowledge and good stuff. And then you have these empires that are becoming beastly. You have the humans and the beasts, the wise and the foolish. And again, all of that will lead to either everlasting life or shame and everlasting contempt, either to heaven or to hell. These things are all fitting together in the grand biblical story. So, the wise get this great promise. Verse 3, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens. Daniel's a great example of this. But we have this great promise of a joyful eternity apart from all the suffering and destruction that God's people are going through all throughout the book of Daniel. But then, after this great encouraging word, verse 4, Daniel is then told to seal up the words of this scroll until the end of time, till the time of the end. That's kind of an interesting move. You might wonder why. I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but I do have a comparison. I think it's really quite interesting to compare the angel's instruction here to seal up the scroll versus what happens in Revelation 22. Again, at the very end of the Bible, we have another angel speaking to the Apostle John. And at the end of all the revelations, the visions that John gets, the angel tells him, Revelation 22, verse 10, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll, because the time is near. Wow. Daniel's told to seal it up for a while, but not John, because the time is near. Are we living close to the end? That's a potent question during COVID. Are we living close to the end? Well, at very least we know we're living closer than in the time of Daniel. Even the fact that John is told to keep the scroll open gives us that particular insight. Well, the rest of the vision from verse 5 till the end, it reverts back to the words of Daniel. You hear him speaking as I, like a first person. And we go back to the original setting that this vision started in chapter 10 on the banks of the Tigris River. So Daniel sees two others on opposite sides of the Tigris River, and they're speaking to this angelic being who is kind of like floating above the river. And just as we saw back at the middle of chapter 8 in a different vision, here again we have someone asking the angelic being a question about timing. How long? How long? The angel's answer in verse 7, honestly, it's pretty obscure. So in verse 8, Daniel asks his own question, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? And the answer, which the angel gives in verses 9 and 10, it seems to actually answer the question, not necessarily with a pessimistic ending, but kind of with that same old third option that I gave at the beginning. So let's read verse 10. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined. These are the wise people, by the way. But the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. Seems to be kind of a same old. A somewhat more specific answer, though, to the timing is given in verses 11 and 12. But I'll admit, it's hard to reconcile this answer precisely with a previous answer about a time and 2 times and a half a time, and another answer like that given back in chapter 8. Maybe reconciling all these things down to a precise number with your calculator is kind of missing the point anyway. But a final beautiful closing encouragement is given to Daniel in verse 13. Let me read that one to you. As for you, Daniel, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. Amen. Oh, I love it. It's good. So as we wrap things up here, let's return to our original question. What trajectory do you think that the world is on? Is it going downhill? Is it getting better? Is it kind of same old? Well, we have to admit that some things are getting better in our world. Medical treatments, engineering feats. I mean, all these things. It's an amazing time to be alive when it comes to technology. But from a moral and spiritual perspective, I think Daniel has given us some clues here that at very best, things will be kind of same old until Christ's return. The wise will be getting purified and refined and made spotless as a bride for Christ's return. And the foolish and the wicked will continue to be wicked. Kingdoms set against God will continue to act in beastly ways. But if things are truly going to get worse, I mean, the book of Daniel encourages us to stay faithful, no matter what, no matter how horrible our circumstances get. The person of Daniel is an example of faithfulness to God. We've seen that all throughout the book. But did you notice one little bookend to this book. I hope you did, but I'll point it out to you. In the first chapter, Daniel and his buddies, as we know, they're taken into exile, taken into an indoctrination program in Babylon. And within that time, God gave wisdom to Daniel. And when he had to finally stand before King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of chapter 1, the king was impressed. Fast forward now to the other bookend of the book, the final chapter. Daniel is promised here in this last verse that after he passes away, he will be resurrected at the end of days, and he will rise to stand again before a king, another king, the king of all kings, from whom he will receive his eternal inheritance. That is the hope given to all of us who follow in Daniel's footsteps of faithfulness. Last thing, I have certainly emphasized the original historical context of the book of Daniel here. Haven't waded into too much of the end time speculation stuff. But that said, the book of Daniel certainly points us ahead to the New Testament. It points us ahead to the truth that in the New Testament, evil has been defeated decisively through the cross of Christ. And it points us ahead to the fifth kingdom that Daniel speaks about in his earlier vision. And that kingdom is none other than the full and final kingdom of God, which will reign forever and ever. That kingdom is, of course, mentioned in many places in the Gospels and elsewhere in the New Testament, but perhaps no more extensively and evocatively than in the book of Revelation. It's no coincidence then that the book of Revelation, another book of apocalyptic prophecy, seems to pick up in many ways where the book of Daniel left off. Another twist in the telescope analogy, focusing on the end. So maybe Revelation, maybe another time. I know one of you was interacting with me about that earlier. Maybe another time. I think it'd be a great book to go through. But I say all that to again say thanks for tuning in. This has been a joy for me to prepare and deliver, and I know many of you have commented that this has been helpful to you. I would love for you to, like we've done for other book studies, let me know how this particular book study has impacted you. So you can send me a message, or if you have any lingering questions or other kinds of comments, please let me know. I'd love to hear. But with that, let's conclude this particular book study, and I'll just say a good night to you and a Merry Christmas to everyone. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.